Welcome to the Practice You podcast. My name is Elena Brower. Let's dive into today's conversation regarding life's myriad transitions and how we refine our responses in our relationships, our wellness, our households, our work, and in our practices. You are invited to learn and love and listen with me. Welcome to Practice You. Welcome back to the podcast. I have with me someone I look up to very dearly, who was introduced to me by Nina Simons. We have Dr. Kamilah Majied on the podcast today. She's a professor, therapist, influential thinker in the realms of social justice, emotional wellness. She's a clinical educator, researcher, consultant on advancing equity and inclusion using meditative practices. I've spoken to a few other friends along these lines before, Dr. Majied, and it's a real honor to have you here to bring us back to the ground of our being and what matters the most. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Yeah.
And thank you for the great work that you do, bringing meaningful information to folks via this podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to look through your work, particularly your book, Joyfully Just, which has as a subtitle, Black Wisdom and Buddhist Insights for Liberated Living. It sounds true as your publisher. I'm really happy that I have worked with them in the past and I love them. You make it your business to engage people in experiencing wonder, humor, and insight through transforming oppressive patterns and deepening relationships toward ever-improving individual, familial, organizational, and communal wellness. When I read that sentence, my entire nervous system relaxes. This sort of releasing and transforming of these oppressive patterns is kind of where I want to rest today with our conversation. And, with all gratitude, I'm knowing that I'm going to learn a few things, and I'm also knowing that I have questions that probably won't be able to be answered in our lifetime. So I'd like to start like this, if I may. In your scope of your work, whether it's in Joyfully Just or otherwise, I would love to know from you, what is it that is bringing you the most joy right now?
Well, honestly, it's engagement with music. I talk a lot about Black music in the book as a wisdom transmission. And you'll find that it's used and drawn upon in so many contexts. And yet somehow people fail to realize that there is so much contemplative practice and wisdom in and of Black music. So I've been really enjoying that as a source of inspiration, coupled with a real immersion in the natural environment, spending lots of time in the ocean and in the sun. So I think both of those things have been particularly joyful for me, and they're real joyful aspects of my day-to-day life.
Thank you. You talk about in your book, in Joyfully Just, how Buddhist practice provides one pathway to being the change that we want to see in the world. And this is, as you posit, what human revolution means. Becoming the slower pace, becoming the more inclusive entity, becoming the more thoughtful friend or colleague. You remind us that this means applying our enlightened minds. And you remind us also that Nichiren Buddhism refers to this as the ninth consciousness, this sort of active purification of all other levels of consciousness. But the fact that this is already our state, that we are cruising around in the world with an enlightened mind, and it means we have to actually apply this mind rather than all of the other small, ridiculous, doubting, vindictive minds to the matters at hand. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means to you, this application of your enlightened mind, and how that relates to sort of active purification of all the other levels of consciousness?
Well, it kind of begins with resolve. One of the Buddhist paramis or perfections of mind speaks to resolve. That you kind of have to decide, that you're going to have this mastery of your mind and life. And then from that decision, practice in a way that allows you to manifest that most evolved, most enlightened mind. Because as you say, we have a lot of different mental capacities and states, but it is actually the most important part of our being, one of the most important parts of our being to master. Nichiren Daishonin, who's the founder of Nichiren Buddhism, said, become the master of your mind rather than let your mind master you. And lots of Buddhists have talked about this. The Buddha himself, Shakyamuni, was very much a mind scientist and understood that the mind could be guided and directed, and that if it wasn't, it could go to some pretty dangerous and self destructive and communally destructive places. So it begins with a resolve, a decision, and it's a reiterative decision. It's a decision I make in the morning when I get up and I do my chanting practice. I chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, which is the title of the Lotus Sutra and the principal invocation in Nichiren Buddhism. And as I'm chanting, to manifest my bodhisattva vow, which is basically to live as enlightened a life as I can today and to support others in doing the same. That's pretty much what I resolved to do. And yet I will tell you that life happens to everyone. And, somebody cuts you off on the road and you want to, do some reactionary thing because, the human mind just can shift that quickly. So returning to resolve throughout the day is important. And that's why I talk about having supplemental practices, right? So in the morning, I do my chanting practice, but throughout the day, I do other things that ground me in my highest intentions and my greater self. And often that's music, often that's, engaging with the natural environment. Often it's contemplative dialogue with people to sort through because sometimes it's hard to know this in your own being, right? Like I'll chant and then sometimes I'll have a dialogue with someone to work things out, to work out what's the most enlightened way to approach this challenge. So one of the quotes that I really love from Thich Nhat Hanh is where he talks about how a lot of things, many things can be practiced. For some people, it's walking. For some people, it's, washing the dishes or gardening, right? What grounds you in your awareness of interdependence with all reality? Thich Nhat Hanh said, spiritual practice is not just sitting and meditating. Practice is looking, thinking, touching, drinking, eating, and talking. Every act, every breath, and every step can be practiced and can help us to become more ourselves. So that's where I really invite people to look at some of the wisdom traditions of African Americans in particular, because they're so drawn upon for entertainment purposes, but they also provide a lot of opportunity for grounding and accessing our capacity for self transcendence and growth.
Thank you for that. We haven't talked previously, but I just thought it would be interesting for you to know that I took the Buddhist precepts last year with Roshi Joan Halifax. And
Wonderful.
I know,
Congratulations on that
I
step.
feel so lucky. And now going for chaplaincy to become a chaplain. And I've studied a little bit with so many of the wonderful teachers of color that I have deep respect for. Notably Zenju Earthland Manuel, whom I've interviewed here on the podcast. And her work, her writing, I just want to point out to our listener, when it comes to tradition, when it comes to honoring the roots of Buddhism as a shamanic tradition, there is no other. Read her books, Zenju Earthland. She's an incredible teacher. Coming back to you, Dr. Majied, oppression operates in three intersecting dimensions. Oppression is a part of our very fiber of our being. No matter what color we are, we've been part of it, whether on the receiving or the perpetuating end. These three dimensions are internalized oppression. You might be a woman listening to this of any color. You might be a person of a certain faith. You've probably internalized some oppression. Interpersonal is the second dimension, and that is really between you and someone else or us and other groups. And then institutional. These three together, when I say them all together, it really feels so daunting and so insurmountable. And your book, Joyfully Just, gives us exercises through which to examine which types of oppressions have impacted us and in which of these three dimensions. I want to implore our listener to interact with this book in some way, because the exercises will definitively help you recognize and release some oppressive patterns that you may have developed as a result of being oppressed yourself. I can see my own, and I'm not proud of them. I could see them in my parenting throughout the time before my kid left for college. I could see them in my ways of relating with employees when I used to have my own business. And I can see how and where they came from when I was a child, the way teachers would talk to me, male teachers versus female teachers, the way some female teachers had internally brought themselves to such a place of oppression that they themselves became oppressors of other women and girls. Really dramatic. And in looking through these exercises, I really felt like, okay, there's so much work to do. And I'm on the road. We're on the road. And I thought it might be interesting for you, Dr. Majied, to maybe talk about one or two of the exercises that our listener could relate to and perhaps work with, if you have them on the top of your head, if you have the book nearby, just to share a little bit about them and see what resonates with us.
Well, thank you for saying that, because yeah, it can seem a little daunting, especially when we recognize we're in this kind of matrix of intersecting oppressions, right? That in a way there's a transactional, and there is an interdependent relationship between the institutional oppression and internalized oppression. Because, for example, as you say, and as I talk about in the book, if in school we're learning that our voices don't matter as young people, and we'll learn no more when we're older, and we're learning certain things about this gender and being female versus being male, or we're learning these things as young people, then our internalized oppression is forming as a result of that institutionalized oppression, right? And if we're learning to devalue ourselves because of what our parents are saying, then our internalized oppression is being informed by that interpersonal oppression that we're experiencing from our parents or guardians. So the three domains of oppressive experience all have psychological and behavioral impact. And the good news, though, is vice versa. So that once we begin to get mastery of our minds and have agency over the way that we think about things, the more free we are, what in our relationships and in our institutions, and can create the kind of transformation that we want to see. So it's actually very exciting when we come back to this idea of being the change we want to see. It really is a process of human revolution. That's what it means to be the change you want to see, and to look at the ways, just as you have in the practices, look at the ways that I've internalized some oppressive ideas about myself as a woman, as a non binary person, as a non heterosexual person, as a person of global majority of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, or Asian heritage, like whatever kinds of oppression we've internalized, those are opportunities for us to excise and release those and be more just towards ourselves. And, some of the exercises, for example, in the Power and Playfulness chapter, where I talk about adultism and young people's oppression, are really good foundational starts. I mean, obviously, I would encourage people to kind of begin with some of the basic grounding and self awareness, just paying attention to what our quality of mind, heart, body, and spirit is in a given moment before doing exercises and activities in the book, just to get your own kind of baseline of experience, because there are some grounding activities like that in the introductory chapter of the book. And then moving into the excising adultism and looking at what are the messages that I learned about my body, for example, as a young person? What are the messages I learned about my mind? What are the messages that I learned about relationships and what kind of relationships mattered and what kind of relationships were appropriate, right? Because when we start looking at those things, we see where we developed either a sense of our own power and agency or a sense of powerlessness. We also all learn things growing up about, sexual orientation. We learn things about gender. We learn things about ethnicity and skin color, right? So looking at our early experiences will allow us to track when and where we absorbed oppressive ideas. And then we can begin the work of releasing them. So those kinds of activities allow us to begin this human revolution process that you referred to. And my principal mentors is Dr. Daisaku Ikeda, and he talks about how there are all kinds of revolutions: political revolutions, economic revolutions, industrial revolutions, scientific revolutions, artistic revolutions. But no matter what one changes, the world will never get any better as long as people themselves remain selfish and lacking in compassion. And in that respect, human revolution is the most fundamental of all revolutions, and at the same time, the most necessary revolution for humankind. And I would even offer that as we continue to experience technological revolutions and other types of change in the world, if we ground it all in this, how do I evolve as a human being perspective? What if we look for that in our political leaders, right? Where is the growth? Where's the evolution? I think it would be radical if people had to speak to that as part of, political leadership and all kinds of leadership, educational leadership as well. How am I evolving? How am I growing? I think that there would be a lot more depth to what we're seeing in far less superficial kind of leadership. Because without that fundamental internal revolution that you're talking about, that courage that you're exhibiting when you notice, oh, okay, I have this, and I have this. Okay, I got to clean all these things up. That takes a degree of emotional courage. But the reason that I invite readers and people I work with into it is because it's also very, very liberating. It's like you're free. We're free to divest ourselves of all of these trappings that compromise our view of ourselves and compromise the most liberating and joyful relationships we could have with our loved ones and the institutions we engage.
A couple of things. One of my teachers, Roshi Joan Halifax, she said recently that she has a special kind of hope in this moment in time. And it gave me the courage to talk in this particular interview, to make a note about the development of our own emergent strategies to bring this relationship to joy to the forefront and stop being so serious about things. And I think that this is a really important thing to turn to for our listener, activist and writer, obviously Adrienne Maree Brown. She talks about this concept of emergent strategies. She says you said this in reference to her concept. Mm-hmm. All joyfully just action is an emergent strategy because it is a positive response to what is arising in a given moment. My teacher calls it an unprescribed, unmediated response. Brown describes this as responding to and generating change with compassionate intentions based on the interdependence of all things, Thich Nhat Hanh's interbeing. And she talked about how learning to be fractal, in quotes, meaning, as you write, making small changes that have the ripple effect of a wider impact. I can feel that around me in my community. I can feel it in my house. And you go on to say that what it means to become joyfully just is to make these small changes by being more just toward ourselves and one another, out of our heightened awareness of our connection to all life. So the minute that somebody, whatever, cuts you off or who knows what, you look over to that person and you just imagine like their mother is dying. Their wife is in the delivery room. Like, who knows what's happening? Their kid is missing. Who knows? And if we're all interconnected, how can we possibly call a ridiculous, angry reaction an emergent strategy? An emergent strategy is something like a deep breath, maybe even a smile, and kind of a laugh at what almost happened within your chemistry, within my chemistry in that moment. An emergent strategy is a meditation practice. An emergent strategy is your chanting in the morning, the line of the Lotus Sutra, to literally liberate yourself and all beings. Those are emergent strategies. And I would love to find out from you, Dr. Majied, what some of your personal emergent strategies are aside from your chanting practice and your dancing practice and the ocean.
Well, it's interesting because they vary, because it is what emerges, but it's always informed by this perspective that there's value in this moment and in this difficult circumstance. Because I'll tell you, for example, when I was, writing the book or, struggling with a million edits and the editorial process, even in different circumstances now, my friends will say, well, what's the joyfully just approach to dealing with that problem?
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
I just have to laugh because there always is one. So I deeply appreciate my friends, but it's fundamentally developing this mindset that there's always value and there's always humor and beauty, even in the worst of moments. And there's value that I can create. But one of the important things is to release the kind of clinging to comfort and the association of compassion with comfort. That it is compassionate towards ourselves to get a massage. It's also compassionate towards ourselves to get a breast exam and a colonoscopy, right? The latter two are not comfortable at all. So, one of the things I really like to help people understand is that being just towards yourself is not always going to feel good, right? Being just towards ourselves, being compassionate towards ourselves involves the capacity to manage discomfort and to develop what I call discomfort resilience in the book. We get so comfortable with discomfort that we naturally lean into it. And the thing about that is that that keeps you more joyful too, because being uncomfortable no longer becomes a reason to be joyless, right? So if I'm comfortable with discomfort and somebody says to me, oh, Kamilah, that comment that you made just then was ageist, then I can say, wow, I really need to look at my ageism. Thank you, right? I can appreciate it as an act of compassion that they even told me. And my discomfort resilience allows me to process that information like, oh, this person is helping me figure out how to be more just towards myself because I will be aged one day and we are all aging as well as being more just towards others. So if we can kind of have that perspective, then we have more of a capacity to be joyful in the difficulties of our relationships with one another. And I agree that this is, I think all times have kind of unique joy and possibility. Like as we watch, people kind of protest and stand for justice, you'll see how often African American liberation songs are used. Songs like This Joy That I Have, the world didn't give it to me, and the world can't take it away. This is an African American gospel song, or We Shall Not Be Moved. And they're talking about spiritual resolve, right? That's what that song means. I have spiritual resolve. Obviously, African Americans have been moved and moved, right? That's what the whole enslavement and trafficking process were. And it also is what Jim Crow was, right? You can't be here, you can only be there. It's what redlining is in the contemporary era. It's what police anti-Black violence is. It's the constant moving and restricting of Black people's movements. But songs like I Shall Not Be Moved are actually speaking of spiritual resolve, that I will remain joyful and I will remain committed to my own awareness of my inherent freedom and my inherent connection to all life. And it's those very songs that people generations later from every, ethnic group around the country and around the world are using because they speak to the self-transcendent, triumphantly joyful aspect of human existence. The part that knows, that's why even Black music has been referred to as soul music, because it's music that moves the body, the mind, and the soul itself to higher ground. So when I see things like that, I feel very hopeful as well.
Thank you so much for that. When I would travel, if I was going to be away from home on a Sunday, I would always seek out the local Baptist church in whatever town I was. And I would sit in the way back and just listen and let the waves of faith enter my heart. And it changed me. Like, it made me who I am today. Those hours spent in those communities were priceless for me. I have a tear in my eye. Oh, thinking about it.
Yeah, I can understand that. It's very moving, and it's significant that it's people who face the worst suffering that were kind of offering this spiritual elevation, especially if it was a Black Baptist church, people who may have had less privilege than you did and less freedom in the material world than you did, right? So that's a thing to really learn from. That's why I kind of direct my readers' gazes to the self-transcendent leadership of Black people, because the last chapter of the book, I talk about joyful suffering and how the circumstances of pain and suffering do not have to rob us of joy. We can actually be in a joyful relationship with suffering. And that's very much been symbolized by the leadership of Black people through music, gospel music, and blues too, jazz too, maybe even a little hip hop.
You quote your mentors and guides, including many musicians, Louis Armstrong, Stevie Wonder, Lou Rawls, Herbie Hancock, Billie Holiday, serious. And you include also writers like Octavia Butler, Toni Morrison, Bell Hooks, Alice Walker, Maya. What struck me the most, and this is really important to me as a person of the Jewish faith / Buddhist faith, is that your mom introduced you to Islam first and then to Buddhism to, as you say, bolster and deepen wisdom and joy in our lives, meaning the kids of your mother. I have recently made best friends with somebody who practices Islam, and this feels important to me and enriching to me. And I'm starting to really see the truth of the fact that all of it is leading to the same place. All of it is asking for the same thing. All of it is bolstering the same story within us. It's a story of hope. It's a story of transcendence. It's a story of revolution, human revolution, as you say. And I thought it might be interesting just to hear, kind of moving toward the end of our conversation, how that impacted you as a child. And then your mom, Layla, let's say her name, then moved you toward Buddhism.
Yes, Kamilah Majied. It was very wonderful to be able to, practice Islam as a child, to be able to do the embodied movements. Because if you've ever watched Muslims pray, there's movement, there's bending on your knees, there's standing, there's turning, and that all has meaning about how the body itself can align with its spiritual intentions and with the highest spirituality in the universe, right? And also the emphasis on learning in Islam, that it's very much obviously a spiritual tradition that's grounded in transmuting and developing knowledge that's wise, right? And the wise application and understanding of knowledge. So it was wonderful to be raised Muslim and to be able to do the practices, do the prayers, and read the Quran. And it was also wonderful to live by the Islamic credos of this expansive educational life that was based on having the wisdom to be good in the world and to be happy in the world and to notice our connections in the world. There's a wonderful book called Green Deen that's about ecology. Deen refers to the way of life in Islam. And the author's name is escaping me at the moment, but Islam is such a beautiful tradition, and I'm very happy that it was the practice of my early youth, especially because I learned about invocation. Like, I still know the prayers that I learned in Arabic because they're kind of embodied in my being. And that, I think, served as a really good precursor for me understanding that, saying words in the original language they were written has a particular kind of resonance in your life. So that when I started chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, it didn't feel strange. I was already attuned to the ways that a mantra or a prayer in a language that was not my native language could have a meaningful spiritual resonance for me. And I think that that's a wonderful thing about having a diverse kind of spiritual lens. I feel like whatever religious or spiritual traditions we practice, to be able to appreciate and understand the depth and breadth and those synergies, as you say, because certainly Judaism also has this deep kind of learning and service tradition and value, right? And then when we recognize those common values, it's easier for us to recognize our interdependence and our connection with all people and to support the peace and the justice that we all deserve.
Thank you so much for that. I have so many more questions, but I'm going to focus now on fierce compassion. What is your relationship at this time to that word, to that term, Dr. Majied?
When I talk about fierce compassion, it's again this idea that compassion isn't always comfortable, and it's the most compassionate thing we can do in the world is to speak up for justice, right? And that does involve courage, but that courage is our own benefit. It is our own freedom, right? So when I'm scared if I say this, it's going to be perceived that way. When we hold back on things that we know are right, and I'm not saying you say everything that's off the top of your head. I love the expression from Confucius where he says, 9 thoughts to every word. Now, I don't think I pulled that off. I don't think I always give 9 thoughts to every single word. And I do think I slow down a lot and think about what I'm going to say. And that's a good thing. We always feel like we have to fill every silence. And as a therapist and as someone who educates therapists, there's so much wealth in silence and, so much meaning in what is unsaid and creating some space in there. But fundamentally, when I think about fierce compassion, I think about the fact that we get to just be with ourselves in a way that's about growth. So, a lot of people, for example, talk about self care and again associate that with comfort. But self care often involves doing things that are very uncomfortable. And for that, we need fierce compassion. We need the compassion to say to ourselves, I know you want to stay on the couch and watch TV, but a short walk would be great right here, or, a trip to the gym would be great right here. I know you just want to kind of yell at your partner or your child, right? That we feel those feelings. With compassion towards ourselves, we say, okay, but what's a higher level of interaction that's going to make me feel more expansive, that's going to help me grow? How can I respond in a way that's going to help me grow? That when we challenge ourselves in those ways, it's good. And also speaking up about situations that are wrong. And sometimes you'll experience, backlash or people pushing and saying, oh, you shouldn't say anything about it. It's not safe to speak up about it, but it just doesn't feel good. I've listened to so many people say, I really want to speak up about the genocide in Gaza, but I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm afraid. And I'm like, well, the part of you that wants to do so is this piece of you that is awake and aware of our interdependence and that has fierce compassion for yourself and other beings. It's just a matter of turning to yourself and saying, okay, well, what do I need to be true to my ideals? In what ways do I need to be strengthened to be true to our ideals? And so I offer a lot of practices in the book to help people, because that disconnect between what we want to say and who we want to be in the world and what we actually wind up doing makes us very unhappy. If you're tolerating a lot of oppressive language and so forth at work or in relationships with people, it just sucks the life force out of people. And a lot of times people think, well, it'll be easier if I just say nothing. But what I offer is that it actually isn't. It has a psychological and an embodied impact, that there's lots of research that shows what responding to oppressive variables does to physical health, particularly a lot of research about this in the experience of people of color, Latinx, Black, Indigenous, and Asian people. When we just kind of stay silent about it, it feels like we're keeping the peace in a particular kind of way, but it has this physical impact, right? So there's just a freedom that we can access when we practice to arouse wisdom first, right? Because we don't want to say every thought that comes to our heads. And then when we practice with fierce compassion in mind, like what's the most fiercely compassionate way I can do this with myself and the beings I'm trying to influence in mind, then the way we say things comes out differently. And it doesn't mean, though, that it will always be received the way it was intended, but at least we can spend a little time refining the offering of our compassionate corrections and compassionate justice endeavors in the world. We can do them in a way that's thoughtful and that elevates the humanity of those we're engaging with as it elevates our own.
Thank you so much. To this point, you quote your teacher, Daisaku Ikeda, as saying, compassion is often thought of as akin to pity. But whereas pity may be condescending, compassion springs from a sense of the quality and interconnectedness of life. And because genuine compassion is about empowering others, helping them unlock strength and courage from within their lives in order to overcome their problems, it may sometimes appear stern or contradictory. That's something we could sort of unpack for a very long time. Very wise.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Like, what if we started viewing things that way? If we had the rigor, the internal emotional rigor, what I call discomfort resilience, to say, okay, you're pointing to a place I could grow. You know what I mean? And if we receive things that way, everything is a growth opportunity and nothing is an attack. And as I say this, I'll circle back for 1 minute to the piece about young people's oppression, because the thing about when we're children, many of us were corrected harshly, such that we develop this kind of free floating shame, so that anytime we're corrected in the present, we're right back to that 5-year-old or 7-year-old who got that harsh correction and is carrying that shame. So, a big piece of the work of being able to be fiercely compassionate towards ourselves and to receive fierce compassion and develop discomfort resilience is releasing that free floating shame. When we feel that come up, right, when somebody says, oh, this is a mistake, or that's racist, or if we feel shame, we can notice that we might feel somewhat ashamed of what we did in that moment, but that there may also be some early shame that this is linking back to. So the more we explore those youthful experiences and release the early shame, the more we can be present to receive corrections without going down a deep, abysmal hole of shame. Every time somebody corrects us, it's like, oops, all right, let me fix that. Let me correct that. Let me apologize. Let me repair. You know, I talk about reparative relationality in the book because, you know, anytime people think about reparations, right, for Indigenous people, for African heritage people, they think, oh, that's something that the government has to do. But we actually get to be in relation with one another in ways that create repair and that correct the legacy of white supremacy, right? That if I have the opportunity to get some resource myself as a teacher or a leader or a podcaster, I can use those opportunities for leadership to elevate the voices of people who've been marginalized. And not because I'm altruistic, because I want a more inclusive and therefore wiser depiction of reality in my work and life. That's the reason.
You know, to this point, in your useful terms and concepts in the book, you talk about the people of the global majority, as you mentioned early in our conversation here. I'm going to read from your book because I think it's important for our listener. I know that I stand corrected here. PGM is a term that emerged in dialogue under the leadership of social justice educator Dr. Barbara Love. It was coined as an alternative to the term people of color. I introduced this term to meditative practitioners as a way of recognizing, thinking again, about Indigenous, African, Latinx, and Asian heritage people. Using the term people of the global majority, or PGM, can itself be a reflective practice, a language liberation practice that invokes a more just worldview. Saying PGM frees us, this is important, from using the language of enslavers and colonizers who labeled humans by color and judged people's worth based on their proximity to whiteness. It takes my breath away. It is also a way of shifting our collective awareness to notice that African, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian people are not quote-unquote minorities when viewing humanity in the global context. In fact, people of the global majority is a term that reminds us that although the ancestors and kin of PGM may not reside in the privileged realms of the West in large numbers, they are present everywhere and have been intrinsic to the stewardship and development of every part of the world we now live in. And in using this term, we remind ourselves that the majority of the world's population is not of European descent, not white, not global minority. This can help us shift the cognitive distortion that white people are entitled to more resources and more space in the world. And it also reminds us that humanity is a global community, and that any time we decide, we can undo the racism that has cleaved distance between us by naming us white, quote unquote, and colored, quote unquote. Also, we can undo internalized racism, such as the created devaluation and hierarchies among PGM based on phenotypical and behavioral proximity to whiteness. So I stand corrected and thankful in this regard.
Thank you for saying that. And, I don't share the term to be prescriptive. Like, there are lots of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian folks who use the term BIPOC, and I myself don't mind the term BIPOC. What I'm inviting people to do is to look at language and look at how the language might be tripping us up and tricking us a little bit. And certainly terms like minority, right? The world is too global now for us to ever speak of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian people as minorities again, but you'll still kind of hear that language. So that my attempt is to help us kind of get that awareness, right? And it's interesting because I heard some comment about the new Democratic presidential candidate being referred to as a DEI hire. And I was like, well, if it was a DEI hire, that would be someone from the global minority, a white person in the job. Because if we're selecting the world leader, which we often talk about American leaders as being world leaders, then we would want someone from the global majority. That just makes a lot of sense. I say it to invite our consciousness into some freedom from this, white supremacy that's got us thinking that the global minority, that people who are from the global minority really are supposed to have all the opportunities and power. Like, whatever we can do to tweak our language, to look at how our language reflects some of the injustice in the world, using terms like, slave owner, for example. It's like, you can't own human beings, and it makes it sound like a business, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're a trafficker, you're an enslaver, and it's not to be harsh or to be mean or to be overly accusatory. It's to be clear. You know what I mean? It's like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, they were enslavers. A slave owner is a euphemism that makes it sound like I'm just doing business, just owning people. You know what I mean? We can't be just if we don't use language and it's always evolving. Language itself is an emergent strategy that allows us to lean more into justice.
To that end, also, instead of saying slavery, one would say enslavement.
Yeah, that there were no slaves. Black people didn't magically morph into something other than human when they were enslaved. They were still chefs. In fact, many African planters, agriculturalists, many of the enslavers targeted regions where they could grow particular things. Like West Africa was targeted because they were able to grow rice in kind of swampland. So those agricultural farmers from West Africa were enslaved en masse, particularly in the Carolinas, for their skill, right? So these were skilled people who were and captured for their skills to be able to serve the capitalist and colonialist exploitative.
Supremacist.
Yeah, but to refer to them as slaves means you don't see that these were artists and musicians and parents and grandparents and children and potters and furniture makers, many of whom created the structures that, we enjoy in the United States and many parts of the world. So, like, it clarifies our vision of who people are, to use the correct language to describe them.
And if we're going to go there, just so that our listener is abundantly clear, in case this wasn't clear before, or you've never heard this before, listener. So instead of referring to slaves, you would refer to enslaved humans, people. And to know that those are our ancestors, period, full stop. And everything that we enjoy, as you've mentioned several times, in the world of the arts, in the world of food, in the world of music, in the world of dance, our ancestors were enslaved people. And we must really see that.
Exactly. And I talk about them as founders. We kind of limit our scope of the founders to people who had privilege and people who wrote documents, rather than people who made foundational contributions to the nation, people like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. And one of the courses I lead is around just kind of helping people practice with the enslaved people who are part of the lineage of their particular field of work. Because whatever our field of work is, whether it's publishing or whatever it is, if you don't know the people of African heritage, particularly if you're US based, who contributed to that field, you don't know that field as well as you think you did. It's a
Wow.
way of understanding our own work, right? On a deeper level. It's not a service to anyone else other than our own awareness and insight.
Wow. So much of this is taking my breath away. I want to really encourage our listener to get this book, Joyfully Just. It's beautiful. I have an extra copy on the way. If you're listening to us and you would like to receive a copy, all I ask is that you make a comment somewhere where you're listening to your podcast, leave a review, and let me know via email right through my website. Say, I left a review. Here it is. And I would love the copy of Joyfully Just, and I will send it to you personally. I cannot thank you enough, Dr. Majied, for your time. I would like to close with two things. One is for you to share with our listener where they can experience your work, your courses, and just explore how to work with you more.
Oh, thank you. You can visit my website, KamilahMajied.com, and there you'll be able to sign up for the newsletter. I have a newsletter that comes out every couple of months where I let folks know the different free events and in-person events and online events that I'll be leading over the course of the next immediate period. And I'm also developing a Joyfully Just series where I will have mini courses, 3-session courses on each section of the book. So, for example, there'll be a mini course on overcoming young people's oppression and looking at how adultism has functioned and continues to function in our lives. There'll be a section on culturally conscious media engagement, which I talk about in chapter 4 of the book. And there'll be a section on joyful grieving and negotiating aging, illness, death with joy, how we can maintain joy as we go through grieving processes. So I'm really excited about being able to offer that course. So please stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, just visit the website, sign up for the newsletter, and you'll be up to speed about all the things that are happening.
Great. And then lastly, I would like to read this very short, one sentence from your book on fierce compassion. And I thought if you'd like to take us out with any kind of a prayer for humanity or for anything, that would be interesting. And while I read, you can consider if that's something you'd like to do. Fierce compassion is rooted in respect for the inherent dignity and inestimable possibility of one's own life and that of others, and a desire to see that dignity and possibility triumph.
Yes. Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. May all beings be well. May all beings be free.
Thank you so much, Dr. Majied. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been delightful talking with you, and perhaps we can talk again once the series is out and moving.
I would love that, actually. Thank you for asking.